So hello, everybody. Depending on where you're joining from, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. But for all of you, a very warm welcome to this, the 9th Annual America's Spectrum Management Conference. Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to bring my slides live. Apologies. There we are. Good start. As I said, hello, everybody, and welcome to the 9th Annual America's Spectrum Management Conference. My name is Dan Kraft, and on behalf of everybody at Forum Global, I'd like to say how great it is to have all of you with us today. We have over 700 people, I think, registered for this conference from across US, Canada, the wider Americas, and the rest of the world. And we really are delighted to have you all with us. So at this stage, normally we would all be gathered together at our regular venue for this conference, which those of you who've attended before will know is that the National Press Club in downtown Washington, DC. But for obvious reasons, this year, that unfortunately is not possible. And instead, we're all coming together from behind computer screens at our homes, in our home offices, and coming together virtually in this way. So the entire event, as I'm sure you are aware, will be taking place online, using this, our virtual event solution, Forum Vision. But although we are in this virtual environment, those of you who have participated at one of our online conferences before and have used this platform before will know that there are still a number of different features built in to try and replicate some of the benefits you get at a face-to-face event. So benefits in terms of networking, interaction, side meetings, chance to kind of have one-to-one chats with each other. So we've built all of those aspects in, and alongside the main presentations, panels, and sessions, there will be the opportunity to do that. We're going to be showing a video shortly to provide more information on all of this and to hopefully give a few tips on how to make the most of your time with us at the conference. And we do invite you all to please take advantage of these different opportunities and get involved as much as possible. And one thing related to that, as I said, we are going to be showing a video shortly, but I did just want to mention at this stage one interactive part of the platform, and that is the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen. I can see from the platform that some of you have found that already and posted messages, so thank you for that. But we invite you during all of the sessions, all of the presentations, to please use this area to post any comments and questions that you may have for the speakers, for the panelists, or just generally on the current content that is taking place. These questions are going to be passed to the moderators and put to speakers and panelists during the session. So as I said, please do get involved and make sure you're making your voice heard. In a second, it's going to be my pleasure to officially open the conference and introduce the moderator for our first session. But before we did that, I just wanted to mention a couple of things on the housekeeping side. So first of all, I wanted to say a huge thank you to all of our sponsors and partners for the support of the event. You can see the logos for all of our different partners, all our different sponsors on the screen next to me now. We really do appreciate all of your support and all of that you do to make the event possible. So thank you very much. And as I said, really is appreciated. I also wanted to mention the hashtag for this event. So you can see that at the top of the screen here, hashtag America's Spectrum. So as well as being broadcast here on the event platform, the event is being streamed live on Twitter via our Global Spectrum Series account. And for all of you who are joining us in that way, and for anybody else who wants to tweet or post messages about the event on social media, please do so and use that hashtag America's Spectrum. Finally, I wanted to mention the presentations and also the session recordings from all the proceedings that are taking place throughout the course of the week. So at the end of each day, there is going to be an email sent to all of you, which will contain a link to enable you to download both the presentations, the slides from all the presentations that are made, and also the recordings, the audio and video recordings from all of the sessions. So you will receive an email at the end of each day with those links. And you will also find a link to those in the main reception area on the platform. So if there is anything you missed or wanted to watch again, then please feel free to do so. So next, on to the program for today. So we have a busy day ahead of us, as we do all this week. So you can see just on the screen here the proceedings that we have today. Following these brief introductions from myself, we are going to be moving to our opening keynote presentation, and we're delighted to have Chairman Ajit Pai with us, who's going to be delivering a presentation to kick us off. So shortly we'll be moving on to that keynote presentation. We then moved straight from that onto our first session. The first session is going to be looking at COVID-19 and the impact and lessons for the Spectrum community. before we then move to a short networking session. So I've mentioned about the interactive areas. We're going to be showing that video I talked about during that session there, and then providing you with an opportunity, a first opportunity, to try out the networking areas and maybe to interact and to chat with some of your fellow attendees. We then have a short break before we return here onto the main stage at 11:30, and I should mention all these are local time in Washington, DC time, local EDT, and we're moving back onto this main stage for our second main session, which is going to be looking at the evolving shape of the US wireless landscape. The full schedule for today and for all of the days at the event is available in the reception area of the platform, and also via a small calendar icon that you'll see at the top of your screen. So you can click on that and see quickly all of the different proceedings and what's going on. And you will also find a calendar link next to each session. So if you wanted to look through and add the sessions that you want to attend to your calendar, you can do using the icon next to them as well. So lots going on, and this is just day one. So we're really looking forward to both today and the rest of the week's proceedings. But without further ado, I would now like to, as I mentioned before, officially open the conference and welcome to the stage Joanne LeMay from LeMay Yates Associates. Joanne, welcome. We're really looking forward to this morning's sessions. I know you're going to be both introducing Chairman Pai and then also moderating our first session. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to yourself. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you to all the team at Forum Europe for putting this conference in the online format. We know how much work this is, a lot more work actually than an actual in-person conference. So we thank you very much, and I look forward to participating and contributing to the conference. I want to do a special shout out this morning to everyone in the US and Canada and everywhere else that's taking time to participate in this, and to my Canadian friends who are taking time away from Canadian Thanksgiving to participate in the Spectrum conference instead of maybe going golfing this morning. So just to start, as Dan really well explained the format for this morning, and I want to start by introducing a man I think who needs no introduction, but Chairman Pai of the FCC. I think I have to say it's extraordinary, actually, the work that's been done by the FCC in a pandemic year, and kudos to you, Chairman Pai. And I want to also mention to the audience that you will take questions at the end of your talk, so we'll make sure that we have room for that. And I have to mention this morning, there was a Nobel Prize awarded to auctions economists, including Mr. Milgram, Paul Milgram, and I know that he's worked a lot with the FCC. The FCC has been key in pushing spectrum auctions around the world. I guess they were a precursor in this. So kudos again to the FCC for that. That work is being recognized now, certainly with a Nobel Prize to some of your collaborators. So I think that's really important. And I have one last question for you, Chairman Pai. Will Ginger join us, or is she going to sneak around you, or I'll let you go to your talk right away?
Well, oh my God. Well, thank you so much, Joanne, for that introduction. I'm thrown for a loop. Ginger is currently taking a nap, but I promise you, if she wakes up, and you'll hear if she does, I will bring her to the stage as well to answer any questions you might have. Thank you as well for mentioning the Nobel Prize. What a great way to start off the week, to wake up in the morning to see that Paul Milgram and Robert Wilson have been awarded the Nobel Prize in economics for their pioneering work on auction theory. And the citation for the Nobel Prize specifically mentions the Federal Communications Commission auction that they designed in 1994, which is their best known work. So very great way to recognize the importance of economic analysis to the FCC's work, and indeed to the work of telecom regulators around the world. Thank you, Joanna and Dan, for hosting this conference, for letting me participate. I'm very excited to be here, or I should say to be here again. As you know, this is the third straight year that I've participated and spoken at this event. And I think when making a return speaking engagement, it's good to have a rule of thumb, which is to review your earlier remarks. I mean, basically, you want to know if you made any big pronouncements that the audience would expect you to have followed up on in subsequent years. You know, in other words, whether you did what you said you were going to do. And I did that. Having revisited my 2018 remarks, you might ask, well, how do they hold up? And as Larry David might say, pretty good, if I may say so. First of all, my opening joke was surprisingly prescient. I'll spare you the elaborate setup, but in a nutshell, it was basically a discussion about how after only 4 NFL starts, the phenomenal quarterback Patrick Mahomes had me believing that my beloved Kansas City Chiefs were legitimate Super Bowl contenders for the first time in my life, and how I was never going to stop talking about this promising development. Having tempted fate like this, I'm honestly shocked that it came to pass as it did. The Chiefs are Super Bowl champions. Patrick Mahomes was named MVP, and I've documented this fairy tale story with hundreds, if not thousands, of tweets ever since then. But in all seriousness, Patrick Mahomes was not the only shiny new thing that I talked about that day. The centerpiece of my 2018 remarks was the FCC's new 5G fast plan. And when I say new, it was really new, as in just 5 days old. I announced the plan at a White House summit the previous Friday. 2 years on, as we approach the end of my 4th year as FCC chairman, it's interesting to take stock of how we've done when it comes to executing that plan. The 5G fast plan had and still has 3 basic parts: freeing up more spectrum for the commercial marketplace, making it easier to deploy the wireless infrastructure of the future, and modernizing our regulations to advance fiber deployment, which is, of course, critical for backhaul. Now, considering this is, of course, the Spectrum Management Conference, I thought I would start with the airwaves. We've been taking a very aggressive all-of-the-above approach when it comes to spectrum. We're freeing up low-band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum for 5G. High-band spectrum, of course, enables high-speed, gigabit-plus wireless connectivity. Last year, the FCC successfully concluded 2 auctions of millimeter wave spectrum for 5G in the 28 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz bands, respectively. Earlier this year, we concluded the bidding in an auction of the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. This was the largest auction in American history, releasing 3,400 megahertz of spectrum into the commercial marketplace, drawing very well on the inspiration, of course, from Mr. Milgram and Mr. Wilson so many years ago. All told, we have made, over the last several years, almost 5 gigahertz of high-band spectrum available for commercial use through these auctions. Now, to put that in perspective, that was more spectrum than was used for terrestrial mobile broadband by all wireless service providers in the United States combined previous to that time. Now, with respect to low-band spectrum, we finished repurposing spectrum in the 600 megahertz band, which was long used for broadcast television, for mobile broadband. To clear the 600 megahertz band spectrum for wireless use, roughly half of our nation's broadcast TV stations, nearly 1,000 in total, had to change their transmission frequencies. This summer, we completed this enormous undertaking known as the repack. Now, all of the valuable low-band airwaves sold in the groundbreaking broadcast incentive auction are available for wireless broadband service. And this spectrum is already being used to provide 5G service to areas where over 200 million Americans currently live. Now, I got to see a glimpse of this 5G future for myself during a visit to Nevada last year, where I saw a T-Mobile deployment delivering over 180 megabit per second speeds using 600 megahertz spectrum, transmitted from an antenna almost a mile away. But since we first rolled out the 5G fast plan, I would say that we've actually made the most headway on mid-band spectrum. Mid-band spectrum is appealing, as most probably know, for 5G because of the physics. It combines good geographic coverage with strong capacity. Under my direction, the FCC has been systematically identifying mid-band airwaves that were being unused or underused, and set plans to put these airwaves to work for the American consumer. In July 2019, the FCC adopted flexible new rules for the 2.5 gigahertz band. This is our nation's single largest band of contiguous spectrum below 3 gigahertz, and is very well suited for 5G development. We approved a tribal priority window so that tribal nations in rural America would have early access to 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. That window closed on September 4th, and we received over 400 applications. Commission staff have already conducted an initial review of and accepted for filing 157 of these applications. And we intend to auction any remaining spectrum shortly after we finish processing the applications filed during that window. And we also targeted rule changes to bring the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum band into commercial use. The rules for this band had not been optimized to encourage 5G development and deployment. But with the leadership of my colleague, Commissioner O'Reilly, we designed new rules to promote investment in the band. This past August, just several weeks ago, the FCC successfully completed an auction of 70 megahertz of licensed spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band, the first ever auction of mid-band spectrum for 5G in the US. We've completed the necessary technical work so that the band's entire 150 megahertz is now available for commercial use. Now, the Commission's biggest move to free up mid-band spectrum for 5G is in the swath of spectrum from 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, called the C-band here in the US. This spectrum is mostly used by fixed satellite companies to beam content to video and audio broadcasters, to cable systems, and to other content distributors. However, because of advances in technology, these companies can now provide the same services using alternative technologies or considerably less spectrum. And that is why this past February, the FCC voted to clear the lower 300 megahertz of the C-band and make 280 megahertz of it available for 5G through a public auction, with the remaining 20 megahertz a guard band. All eligible space station operators currently using this spectrum have committed to an accelerated relocation to the upper 200 megahertz of the C-band, meaning that the lower 280 megahertz will become available for 5G 2 to 4 years earlier than otherwise would have been the case. And we're currently on track to begin our auction of that lower 280 megahertz of the C-band on December 8th. And just a couple of weeks ago, at the FCC September meeting, we proposed to make the 3.45 to 3.55 band available, a gigahertz band available for innovative commercial operations, while accommodating limited remaining operations by federal agency incumbents. This action follows through on the White House and the Department of Defense August announcement that this 100 megahertz of contiguous mid-band spectrum should be made available for 5G as quickly as possible. And I'm optimistic that we will be able to hold an auction of the 3.45 gigahertz band next year. The bottom line of all of these mid-band efforts I have just described, 2.5, 3.5, 3.7, and 3.45 to 3.55, is this. With all of these aforementioned efforts, we are on a path to have a contiguous 530 megahertz swath from 3.45 to 3.98 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum available for 5G. That is 5G fast. Now, by any measure, this has been the most aggressive FCC in history when it comes to spectrum. And remember, spectrum is just one of the 3 planks of our 5G fast plan. We've been similarly productive on the other 2, promoting wireless infrastructure and modernizing our regulations to encourage fiber deployment. Among our efforts on those 2 fronts, we set a reasonable deadline for cities to rule on siting applications, making it easier to install wireless infrastructure like small cells. We required localities to set non-discriminatory fees for small cells and prohibited them from charging more than the reasonable costs. We clarified the FCC's rules for when upgrades of wireless infrastructure equipment on existing structures qualifies for streamlined state and local government processing, which will eliminate disputes and accelerate the build-out of networks. We also adopted our one-touch make-ready policy, which makes it much easier for broadband providers to attach fiber to utility poles and opens the door to new entrants who can increase broadband competition. We removed regulations that forced companies to prop up antiquated copper networks instead of investing in next-generation fiber networks. And yes, we ended our nation's failed and thankfully short-lived experiment with regulating the internet using heavy-handed rules developed in the 1930s for Ma Bell. Now, there is a lot of evidence that these infrastructure policies and others are having a positive impact. In 2018 and again in 2019, for example, the United States set records for annual fiber deployment. And the number of new cell sites in the United States has skyrocketed. We added fewer than 7,000 cells from 2013 to 2016, but added over 87,000 from 2016. All of these efforts to promote the development and deployment of ultra-fast, high-capacity 5G networks, the FCC is committed to making sure that those networks are secure. When 5G is embedded in almost every aspect of our society and our economy, from businesses to homes, hospitals to transportation grids, the manufacturing sector to the power grid, securing our networks will become that much more important and that much more difficult. But the FCC, we have focused on the integrity of the communications supply chain. That is, the process by which products and services are manufactured, distributed, sold, and ultimately integrated into our communications networks. Now, for years, US government officials have expressed concern about the national security threat posed by certain foreign communications equipment providers. To counter this risk, the FCC has prohibited the use of money from our Universal Service Fund from being used by from carriers in the United States on equipment or services produced or provided by companies posing a national security threat, including the world's largest global 5G supplier, Huawei. We also started a process to identify and catalog insecure equipment already used in USF-funded communications networks so that we can work on implementing a program to remove and replace it. It could cost nearly $2 billion to remove this equipment from US carriers' networks and replace it. And we are working with the United States Congress to secure the necessary funding through legislation to do just that. Unfortunately, technological innovation has the potential to address some of these security concerns. In particular, open radio access networks, or open RANs, could transform 5G network architecture, costs, and security. Just last month, the FCC held a forum on open, interoperable, standards-based, and virtualized radio access networks. Among others, it featured the Secretary of State and top experts from the United States and all around the world, from the public and private sectors alike. A consensus emerged from the forum that Open RAN technologies are already showing great promise in the United States and indeed globally, and that the public and private sectors should continue to encourage the development and deployment of these systems, which can enable a diversity in suppliers, improve network security, and lower costs. Now, while I wanted to focus my remarks on 5G this morning, I also need to highlight a major initiative in our work to unleash next generation technologies, and that is Wi-Fi. Because under my chairmanship, the FCC has been aggressively implementing a balanced spectrum policy that is opening up spectrum for licensed and unlicensed use. With our growing reliance on Wi-Fi, including cellular offload, we are going to need faster and stronger Wi-Fi networks. And the good news is that Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E, the next generation of Wi-Fi, has already started rolling out. Wi-Fi 6 will be over 2.5 times faster than the current standard, and it will offer better performance for connected devices. But in order to fully take advantage of the benefits of Wi-Fi 6, we need to make more mid-band spectrum available for unlicensed use. And that's exactly what the FCC did on April 23rd. The FCC unanimously approved my proposal to make the entire 6 gigahertz band available for unlicensed use. By doing this, we are creating a massive 1,200 megahertz testbed for innovators and innovation. This is a big deal. We effectively increased the amount of mid-band spectrum available for Wi-Fi by almost a factor of 5. And remember, this dovetails with the fact that 5G NRU, the cellular specification for 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, is currently in development. Now, ultimately, I expect that 6 gigahertz unlicensed devices will become a part of consumers' everyday lives. And I predict that our decision will play a major role in the growth of the Internet of Things, connecting appliances and machines, meters and wearables, smart televisions, and other consumer electronics, many of which we can't even conceive today, as well as on the enterprise side, things like industrial sensors for manufacturing. So with all that, let me close where I began, with Patrick Mahomes. Yes, he delivered Kansas City its first Super Bowl in my lifetime, certainly the last 50 years, in just his second year in the league. But by all accounts, he is still hungry. He's just getting started. Despite yesterday's loss, the Chiefs are still a favorite in Las Vegas to win it all again this year. And I can say that we at the FCC aspire to follow his lead. I couldn't be more proud of all that we have accomplished over the past 3.5, almost 4 years. But I too am not satisfied. And as long as I'm at the agency, I'm committed to working with all of my colleagues at the FCC and all of you in the private sector as well to unlock the possibilities of 5G and deliver unparalleled wireless innovation and investment and benefits for people around the world. Thank you so much again, and all the best for a successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pai. If I may, if I can start maybe with the first question to get the ball rolling,
Sure.
if I may. I think some of the other initiatives that you are doing this year is, I have to mention the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which I know we're in the quiet period, so we won't talk too much about that, but that's like 16 billion of phase one starting at the end of this month for a reverse auction. And also next month, the FCC, later this month, the FCC will be voting on the 5G rural fund. Can you say, that's not really part of your 5G fast plan, but they are interrelated, or how do you see the link between all these activities? I mean, obviously one will feed the other.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And thank you for giving me a chance to discuss it. It is incredibly important, each of those initiatives. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, for those of you watching who don't know, is ultimately a $20 billion fund that we have established to get high-quality, high-speed broadband to unserved parts of the United States. It's a two-phase reverse auction. The first phase, which Joanna mentioned, involves $16 billion, starts on October 29th. And we've opened it up to competition from a variety of providers, rural telcos, electric utilities, cable companies, fixed wireless companies, and others, so long as they commit to providing service on the terms and within the timeframes that are specified in the FCC's order. And we've put a finger on the thumb in favor of faster speeds and lower latency. And what that means for 5G is critical. For those who are interested in the question, how are we going to find backhaul for all of this 5G traffic, especially in sparsely populated rural areas? The 5G, there are RDOF funds that are going to be distributed and ultimately will build those networks of the future, will help in relation to that. Also, the 5G fund, which you mentioned, Joanna, is a $9 billion fund, which we'll be voting on at the end of this month. October 27th is the FCC's meeting. And there we are looking to set up a fund to target parts of the country that are unlikely to see 5G deployment from a private perspective, where the business case simply isn't there. And our hope is that we ensure that every American, every consumer, regardless of where he or she happens to live, is the beneficiary of this 5G revolution to come. And that's where the 5G fund comes into play. So I hope my colleagues will support it, and hopefully those around the world will find interest in it as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question here from the audience, which we do not see,
Sure.
from Robert at NAB. His question is, at both C-band and 6 gigahertz, the FCC deferred many of the complex technical issues to multi-stakeholder groups. Does the FCC expect to adopt the recommendations of those groups? Is this a process that will likely be continued?
That's a good question. So we have indeed relied on multi-stakeholder groups, and part of the reason is that we understand that these are technically complex questions. For example, in the 6 gigahertz band, we did take some action, and as I said, in establishing the 1200 megahertz for unlicensed operations, but we also teed up some additional questions that required further study, in particular, further technical study. And so hopefully those discussions will be fruitful, and the FCC will be poised to move ahead once we receive some information from those groups, of course, and are satisfied that there's a path forward that accommodates both the incumbent interests that have been illustrated, as well as the need for resolution on some of the next generation uses of that spectrum.
Okay. I have another question from Namal at Mobitel. He says, it was mentioned that Universal Fund is not available to fund the projects rolled out by designated vendors with security risk. So can an operator still go ahead with their own funds with any of these vendors?
Well, one of the things that I should have mentioned as well, but didn't have time to, is the fact that Congress has paid attention to this as well. They've passed recently what's called the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act, and along with the congressional pronouncement, as well as some executive orders and other actions and statements from the executive branch, I think it's very clear that the overall U.S. government, the executive branch, legislative branch, and the FCC as well, have taken a very strong view on security. And so there we have encouraged all of these companies to say, we cannot think about security as an afterthought as you're constructing next generation networks. Think about security up front when these networks are being constructed. That's much better than trying to retrofit an often imperfect solution at the back end. In addition, the Open RAN solutions that I've been discussing are some of the new competitors in this space are very interested in that. For example, Dish, which is looking to build a standalone 5G network. They are embracing Open RAN technologies, not just because they're more secure, but also because of the cost element. And so I would dispute the premise that one has to choose between security and strength of the next generation networks. I believe you can have both, and that is manifesting itself here in the United States.
All right. I have another question now for you, slightly different, touching on the same subject, but from a different angle. RT of European satellite operators. Does Chairman Pai see a role for satellite in 5G?
Oh, absolutely. I think that some of the great aspects of the new space age involve satellite-based communications technologies. And one of the things, it might not strictly be 5G, but we have approved a lot of NGSO, non-geostationary satellite orbited constellations to launch with a variety of use cases that are available, from high bandwidth residential broadband services to relatively low bandwidth IoT type applications. If there is a 5G specific service or application that is possible in space, given the physics, we're more than open to that. And we want to encourage that kind of innovation. And to the extent that it can be delivered through small sats, for example, that's something that I hope our regulatory reforms will encourage. For example, last year, we streamlined the process for small sats so that they don't have to jump through the same regulatory hoops as a big satellite company might have to launch. They don't have to pay the same fees. It's a much lower fee. And we're starting to see some of that development and deployment here in the United States, at least, with companies, startups, satellite companies, explicitly saying that we could not have done this in the United States, but for the fact that the FCC streamlined those rules. So I'm hopeful that there's some 5G satellite operator out there somewhere that is really looking to conquer the final frontier. And we want to encourage that here in the US and hopefully in Europe as well.
Yes. Well, actually, on that fact, when I read the fact sheet for the 5G Rural Fund, service objectives say 35 down, 3 up. So it does, while that may seem to me a little bit low for 5G, but it does open up to me the possibility that satellite can participate in this, no?
One would think, yes. So we, of course, want to see a technical demonstration to the FCC's staff, including our terrific staff in the Office of Engineering and Technology. But so long as the mousetrap works, so to speak, we want all technologies to be able to have a full and fair chance to compete for those funds. And that's part of what underlay our fixed broadband program, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, as well as the Connect America Fund a couple of years ago. We want to make sure that technological neutrality encourages not just competition, but also the innovation so that people keep thinking about outside of the box about ways to solve these problems of connectivity.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered, I think, all the questions that I've received, and I know we're getting to the end of our session, but I know that, I think maybe you won't recall, but last year I had called you the gigahertz man for all these 5 gigahertz of millimeter wave auction that you were putting out. But one thing that I think I'd like maybe this year is to call you the 29 billion man, which I make reference to an earlier to the 2, reverse auctions. Now there's one question which apparently I haven't covered, but it's a little bit more touchy. But the question is, maybe we can finish on that. Would you want to serve as chair for another 4 years if President Trump wins, or alternatively, would you like to serve? Would you be willing to serve as chair under a Biden administration? So please go ahead.
So I've got used to that question to be sure. And look, the way I've described it is we've been sprinting since I started in this job on January 23rd of 2017. We just haven't stopped ever since. If you look at our productivity, we're still at our monthly meetings considering 2x the number of items that we did in any administration previous. I've had a chance to work with the amazing FCC staff over the last several years. And so in the middle of this sprint, I honestly have not had time to think about what comes next. We're just going to keep sprinting to the end of the year, including, as I mentioned, the October meeting where we have a staggering 9 items, I believe it is, for consideration. So, the future will take care of itself. I'll make a decision when it's time to make a decision. But in the meantime, Ginger and I are going to keep our noses to the grindstone and make sure we keep sniffing out further opportunities for innovation in the communication space.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. We haven't seen Ginger, unfortunately, but I know I'll see more of her on Twitter for sure. So
absolutely. A lot of bulldog for those of you who are on Twitter. She's tweeting out incessantly.
That's right. She is. Well, thank you very much. And I hope you have a very good day. And if you have time, maybe you follow up a bit some of the other sessions. So thank you very much, Chairman. It's been an honor again.
Oh, the honor's mine. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. All right, so now it's my turn to introduce, to go to the next session 1, where we have a very distinguished panel of 4 persons, 4 key persons to talk about the impact of COVID on spectrum and telecom and telecom networks. I don't know if Dan, if I could have the agenda for from my presentation on the screen. Here it is. So I will start off. I have a few minutes of introductory comments. We have like a full hour roughly starting from now. And We have our 4 speakers are Matthew Berry, FCC Chief of Staff, Miguel Munoz, who is representing the Ctel, Scott Bergman, Senior VP Regulatory Affairs of CTIA, the Cellular Association, and Tom Strout, President of the Satellite Industry Association. Pardon me, definitely not the same thing. So if we could go to the first chart. As you know, or as most of us know, all in telecom networks, COVID-19 has had a major impact on telecom networks, with a surge in daytime broadband usage, certainly not in downtown areas, but in residential areas. So it's been quite significant. I have a few data points here, and I know that Mr. Bergman of CTIA has others in his presentation, which no doubt will be of interest. I also have, certainly some comments about the overall usage subjected to significant increase, but increase in video streaming subscribership and increase in the share of video streaming as part of overall consumer usage. Now, while in maybe North America, a lot of that usage has been on fixed networks, I think mobile networks have seen a lot of that impact as well. And I note here just, a few statistics on Netflix subscriber increase, double what was expected in the first quarter of this year, and mostly probably, loaded in the last month in March, so 15.8 million versus 7.2, and 10 million as well in the second quarter. So again, a record for that quarter. So certainly there's no, there's been a significant increase in the share of streaming, and that eventually does have also impact on spectrum requirements. The other thing, I think, which we've seen significant pressure on is additional spectrum and deployment in rural areas to bridge the digital divide. Because nowadays, of course, with work from home, telehealth, distance learning, you want your kids to be able to participate in home when they don't have or cannot be present in school. These applications become really critical and critical to continuing life, at least for the foreseeable, in the next few months, hopefully. So that's just one impact. Maybe if I can have the next chart. Okay. I won't go through all of this in detail, but certainly what we want to say here, the FCC was extreme, in addition to all the auctions and everything else, the FCC was extremely active in 2020 in taking measures to facilitate and improve the quality of networks during COVID, and when this increased, or very sudden increase in usage took place. So I have a list here of some of the special temporary access assignment that were given to award, some assigned but not yet used, and some unassigned spectrum between carriers and between other organizations. So that's definitely, I think, been key to helping carriers go through the first wave of COVID, as well as the Keep Americans Connected pledge that carriers also took upon themselves with the FCC initiative. We have here I have to note that a few regulators around the world did delay some auctions, but some of them just slightly delayed, such as the CBRS auction was just delayed by 1 month. France 5G auction in France was delayed by a number of months, but has now since been completed. So it actually has taken place. Canada has delayed its auction by 6 months. It was supposed to start in December of this year. Has now been delayed to June 2021, which is quite a long ways away. And Mexico also has had delay of 600 megahertz and 3.4 gigahertz auction. So maybe we can hear more about that later on. If I go to the next chart. Here I have listed countries around the world really have made spectrum-related interventions. This is a list provided per GSMA. As you can see, releasing spectrum to MNOs in different capacities and sub 1 gigahertz capacity to make it available. So there was certainly a flurry of activities around the world to take into account the surge in usage that COVID caused around the world. So before we start with our first speaker, if I can go to the next chart. I have a few questions here. And maybe we can address them when we get to the panel. So what comes next for spectrum and 5G, right? I mean, COVID will not last forever. Hopefully, we hope not. So I have some questions here that maybe some of you may want to chime in on during the conversation. But would you agree that COVID-19 has brought forward the need for additional spectrum by at least 1 year or maybe 2? And that's certainly something that we have seen in the work that we've been doing. Second question, the U.S. mobile carriers are rich in millimeter wave spectrum. As Chairman Pai said, over the last few years, more than 5 gigahertz of millimeter wave spectrum has been auctioned off by the FCC. But now that there's a very fewer people living in downtown and working, especially working in downtown areas, do you think that if we look forward for the next 1 to 3 or even 1 to 5 years, will mid-band spectrum certainly capture a much larger deployment of capital expenditures than millimeter wave? I think that's something that's interesting, even though there's a lot of millimeter wave spectrum out there, but it would seem that maybe mid-band will carry the day for the foreseeable future. The third question is, will carriers expand or accelerate mobile deployment in rural areas? And are the build-out subsidies critical to achieve these goals? That's also something else you'd want to do. Would they do it anyway if they didn't have the subsidies in light of COVID, or just because it's a good business to do so? And the last question relates to the question that RT of the European Satellite Association asked of Chairman Pai: what is the role of satellite and LEO networks to achieve 5G in rural areas? Can 5G performance levels be expected? So I look forward to discussing these with you when we get to the panel discussion. But first of all, let's start with the first speaker. If we can bring Mr. Matthew Berry, FCC Chief of Staff on. And Matthew, the floor is all yours.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Joanne. It's great to be with all of you, and I look forward to a lively discussion with my fellow panelists, Miguel, Scott, and Tom. As you heard, Chairman Pai kicked off the conference this morning with a summary of the Commission's efforts to promote U.S. leadership in 5G. And he noted how all of our major initiatives over the past 2 years have been laid out in his 2018 remarks at this very conference. But while we knew long ago that we would be spending the past few years repurposing spectrum for commercial use and removing barriers to infrastructure deployment, I didn't foresee that we would spend most of 2020 dealing with a once-in-a-century pandemic. I'm proud of all of the FCC's efforts to keep Americans connected during this difficult time. But this morning, given the topic of the panel, I'd like to focus on our work on the spectrum front. When the pandemic hit, we understood that increased demand would be placed on our nation's broadband networks as Americans engaged in social distancing. And with respect to wireless broadband in particular, we quickly recognized that one of our most effective tools for meeting increased consumer demand would be giving providers temporary access to additional spectrum. So on March 15th, just 2 days after the president declared the COVID-19 outbreak to be a national emergency, we granted our first Special Temporary Authority, or STA, to respond to the crisis, allowing T-Mobile to use additional spectrum in the 600 megahertz band. And that was just the beginning. Our strategy was to grant access to additional spectrum wherever possible and wherever it could make a difference. So, for example, since that first STA grant on March 15th, we approved an additional 23 STAs in the 600 megahertz band. We granted STAs to AT&T, US Cellular, and Verizon to use AWS-3 spectrum to expand the capacity of their networks. We also granted AT&T temporary authority to use spectrum licensed to Dish in the AWS-4 band for the purpose of boosting network coverage and capacity in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. We allowed dozens of fixed wireless internet service providers to use the lower 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band. These WISPs deliver internet access to some of the hardest to connect rural communities in our country, and these STAs have made a difference. To give just 2 examples, Skynet 360 in Florida City, Florida, used a 5.9 gigahertz STA to extend network access to over 100 homes in a rural area of the Florida Everglades. And Amplex in Luckey, Ohio, reports that its 5.9 gigahertz STA helped it increase bandwidth across its network by 50% and handle a greater than 30% increase in traffic due to the pandemic. Altogether, the Commission has approved 160 STAs in the 5.9 gigahertz band. And speaking of hardest to serve communities, we approved the temporary use of unassigned 2.5 gigahertz spectrum to provide wireless broadband service over the reservation of the Pueblo of Zuni in New Mexico. We granted 2.5 gigahertz STAs to the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, Santa Clara Pueblo, Lower Brule Sioux, Maka tribe, and the Navajo Nation. And we also approved temporary access to 2.5 gigahertz spectrum to improve access to wireless broadband services in low-income rural communities in Harlan County, Kentucky. Of course, our efforts haven't been limited to providing additional spectrum for use in remote areas. For example, we granted New York City an STA to expand the capacity and coverage of its fire department's communication system using T-band spectrum. This increased bandwidth helped to support emergency medical dispatch operations during the coronavirus pandemic. We also approved 21 STAs for backhaul communications services in the 6, 11, 18, and 70, 80, 90 gigahertz bands. Add them all up, and the Commission has so far approved over 230 COVID-19 related STAs. That averages out to more than one a day since our first on March 15th. And what has been the result? During the pandemic, we've been very pleased by the performance of our nation's wireless networks. For example, according to Ookla, notwithstanding increased demand, in April, average mobile broadband download speeds in the United States were actually faster than they were in February, before the pandemic hit, and they've gotten faster since. I believe that much of this success is due to the policies that we put in place before the pandemic, market-based policies that encouraged investment in broadband networks and made it easier to deploy infrastructure. But making more spectrum available during the pandemic has also made a positive impact. For example, we've seen evidence that our 600 megahertz STAs helped T-Mobile double the speed of its 4G LTE service in certain parts of the country. The last thing I want to say before I wrap up is that all of this work was done on top of the Commission's regular workload. Even with all of our COVID-19 related activity, of which I only mentioned a fraction, the Commission was able to complete major proceedings like our order to make the entire 6 gigahertz band available for unlicensed use, all while working remotely, I would add. So if there's one lesson that I've learned about how to best deal with a crisis like a pandemic, it's to hire and nurture a staff as great as the FCC's. And with that, thanks again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that was quite interesting, and I certainly would like to touch base on those STAs once we get into the discussion and their continued application, for example. Next up is Miguel Munoz of Ctel. So Miguel, if you want to come up and you have the floor, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joan, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. And Mr. Oscar Leon, that is the Executive Secretary of Ctel, apologize for not being here, but I will gladly share with you some actions that we took in Ctel. But first, let me talk about Ctel for those of you that are not familiarized with this organization. So in the next slide, we can see the Ctl structure, and I would like to compare it with the ITU for those that don't know Ctel. Ctel Assembly is like the plenipotentiary conference where the members of the Ctl, that is like the council in the ITU, are selected, and also it is the main body in Ctel. The groups, we only have 2, not 3 like in the ITU, one for all the regulatory aspects, and that is the PCC1, telecommunications and ICT, and the PC2 that is related to all the things of radio communications. So we have these two groups, and the Ctl Secretariat that supports all the work for Ctl, that is where I belong. We in Ctl, in the next slide, can see that are composed by 34 member states and more than 100 associate members, including academia, companies, and civil society. So now that you know that Ctel, or the Inter-American Telecommunications Commission, is an entity of the Organization of the American States and was established in 1993. So we are a governmental body, and we work with governments and also with companies to develop the regional positions that we discuss in world conferences also, and we promote the development of telecommunications in the Ctl countries. So talking about this COVID impact on the telecommunications sector, we can see in the next slide that we try to compile all the information that governments and companies were taking in that moment and put it together to facilitate to others the information that the governments and also the companies were doing. So if anyone would like to know what is doing, I don't know, Colombia with the spectrum in this pandemic situation, they could check. So we did this repository that you can find in the Ctl webpage, and we found that there were 5 strategic actions, the 5 tendencies that every government, or almost every government, were using. The first were actions to encourage the expansion of internet coverage, that is giving or granting permits for temporary use of a spectrum and the deployment of infrastructure. We know that sometimes it is difficult to develop infrastructure because of the bureaucratic work. So in this pandemic, we see that many governments made easy this kind of things. The second strategic action that we can find is to prioritize the connectivity in strategic points. Many were very concerned on how to connect or to get better connection to healthcare centers, to the food distribution centers, and all those strategic points. So there are many actions that you can find in this repository that they did. The third was to encourage rational use of the internet. We saw that, for example, service providers reduce the quality of the videos to reduce this amount of the use of internet, and also many governments start to monitoring the traffic flow because of the peaks, but there were some doubts about the resilience of the infrastructure, but we saw that we have a good infrastructure network, so the internet was enough resilient. The fourth strategic action that we can see is to allow the teams to deploy the infrastructure, and the fifth one was to provide security to the infrastructure, not only physical infrastructure, but also the cybersecurity issues. So these are the main strategic actions that you can find in the repository, all the things that the countries and the companies did, including the ones that were mentioned by my colleague Matthew from the FCC. And finally, in the next slide, we can find that all this information okay, it is available, it is on the website, but let's share these experiences. So we put together the experts in a series of dialogues in 8 roundtables. So they could discuss all these strategic actions and talk also about what is coming, what all of these strategic actions are good enough to keep in the post-pandemic era, to saying that, or the new normal, like many have meant, how call it. And you can see all those videos in the Ctl webpage that is there. And we are trying to develop with the PCC presidencies some kind of recommendation, just in case, to remember that these kind of things can happen and we must be prepared. So we are trying to develop a recommendation in the upcoming meetings of the PCC1 and PCC2. And if we accomplish that, we will be happy to share it with you. So this is some actions that Ctel took during the pandemic to help governments and also companies to keep together. So thank you very much, and I look forward for the discussion.
Thank you, Miguel. That was quite interesting, and I think I'm going to have a peek at those videos in the link that you provided, and hopefully we'll get back to you and have some questions about your initiatives in the panel discussion. So next up is Scott Bergman of CTIA, Senior VP Regulatory Affairs, and I think he has some data points to show us as part of his presentation on that increase in speed and all that. So Scott, please go ahead.
Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to say thanks to Forum Global and to you, Joanne, for inviting me and CTIA to be part of this panel. The fact that we're appearing virtually and not all together at the National Press Club is probably all you need to know about why this panel is important. But I want to draw back the lens a little bit to look at two of, I think, what were really the key framing challenges for the wireless industry this year. The first, promoting the rapid and widespread deployment of 5G, and the second, responding to the rather unexpected COVID-19 pandemic. But I want to make a couple of observations about both of these challenges, because I think both of them have a significant spectrum component to them. I think with respect to both, the wireless industry has really risen to the occasion, and I think the FCC has as well too. And I think third, the work that we've done over the last couple of years, both in terms of investment, build out, and then focus on spectrum policy, really helped those responses. So as Joanne said, I want to use the next couple of minutes to set the stage for what the wireless industry experienced and how it responded to COVID-19. Then hopefully we can talk a little bit more about the FCC spectrum efforts, and particularly how its work to free up mid-band spectrum is so important to meeting challenges like these. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I think in many ways, the pandemic put our wireless networks to the ultimate stress test. Joanne talked about some of the international numbers, but as social distancing kicked in, here in the US, consumers leaned in on their wireless services like they never have before. We saw historic surges in voice and data traffic in different places, and really for a host of new use cases. And we saw all that happen over just a few days. So compared to the weeks before the pandemic, we saw data traffic increase nearly 20%. We saw voice traffic jump by over 24%. We also saw texting increase by over 25%. And again, that happened over just a couple of days. So for perspective, in all of 2019, mobile data traffic grew by 30%, which I think is in itself remarkable. So that COVID increase was the equivalent of almost 8 months of data increases in just days. Next slide, please. So we also saw changes in traffic patterns as well, too. One wireless provider saw an 86% jump in subscribers that were connecting only to the cell sites at their primary location as compared to a typical week. Another provider saw a nearly 30% decline in mobile handoffs. Next slide, please. So not only did we see more traffic and in different places, but we also saw changes in the way that consumers were using their mobile wireless. As you see here, mobile hotspot use skyrocketed. Joanne talked about how the use of collaboration tools increased. But we also saw telehealth visits jump significantly. One survey of seniors showed that telehealth use increased by 300% in the weeks after the pandemic struck. Education app usage has jumped dramatically as well too. Anybody in the audience with kids know how learning has changed in the US. Right, we've got millions of kids learning from home for the first time. And the wireless industry has provided service to, again, millions of kids through some great new initiatives, through partners with school districts. Even at CTIA, we've leaned in on this effort. We launched a new initiative called Connecting Kids to serve as a resource for schools and school districts across the country. Okay, so how did we do? Jordan, if I could have the next slide. I think the evidence is pretty clear that US wireless networks met the challenge. So despite those historic surges, mobile speeds kept pace and consumers expressed widespread approval. The slide that you see here shows mobile download speeds in the months before and after the pandemic hit. And as you can see, there's virtually no drop in performance. It actually, and I think Matthew alluded to this, went up slightly in April. And I think this is particularly remarkable in comparison to other countries where wireless networks really strained to maintain quality and speed. And if you can pull up the next slide, I think you'll see one comparison, which is, again, while US speeds held steady and even climbed in the weeks after the pandemic. If you can give me one more click, Jordan. Missed one animation. If you look here at China, China's speeds decreased by up to 40%. And we saw similar things in other countries as well, too. Over 2/3 of European countries saw decreases, some of them up to 30% in speeds. So let's talk a little bit about how the wireless industry did this. If I could get the next slide, please. Thanks. So US providers were prepared because they invest tens of billions of dollars each year. In 2019 alone, US wireless providers invested roughly $29 billion in their networks to expand that capacity and their coverage. Now, I think this is a direct result of both that strong commitment of CTI member companies to their customers, driven by competition, but it's also a result of the pro-competition regulatory framework that we have that creates incentives for investment and helped us be ready for this pandemic. So kudos to Chairman Pai and the FCC for putting those policies in place. If I could get the next slide, Jordan. So I think it's also worth mentioning that wireless providers also work extremely hard to optimize their networks and add capacity in the weeks after the pandemic struck. And I'll remind you that in many cases, these are frontline workers, so they had to navigate access issues, they had to navigate safety issues while they did that. Next slide, please. So wireless providers were also coordinating closely with DHS, with the FCC, state and local policymakers to, again, get that access to the resources they needed. That meant working with DHS to get access to PPE for essential workers. As Matthew and Joanne talked about, that also meant getting access to additional spectrum resources. I won't go over them in detail. Matthew laid it out. I think it's fair to say the FCC's STAs played a really key role in helping providers keep up with demand. They provided a really significant capacity boost, and not just for national carriers, but for regional providers as well, to give the FCC a lot of credit. They acted very, very quickly and have been a critical partner throughout this process. Next slide, please. So thanks to these collaborative efforts, what we saw is 83% of Americans expressing approval, saying that their wireless internet service met their needs, consumers viewing the industry as having been a key partner in meeting the COVID challenges. And if I can get the last slide, please. So I think as we try to think about what are the lessons learned, what can we take away? For me, the first is the US regulatory framework, which is, again, premised on competition, has allowed that private investment to drive the development of more robust, more resilient networks. Second, US providers stepped up to that challenge, having invested billions before the pandemic, and then being ready to meet consumers' demands during this really challenging time. And for me, I think one of the key takeaways is just how important our focus on spectrum and infrastructure policy is. Chairman Pai talked a little bit about how the FCC is working very hard right now to hold the C-band auction in December, where it'll make 280 megahertz of key mid-band spectrum available. That'll be a really important capacity boost. It'll enable new investments and deployments of 5G. He also mentioned the FCC's new proceeding to make available 100 megahertz of spectrum in the lower 3 gigahertz band. This is a band that's been embraced around the world for 5G. And I think the FCC and the administration should really be commended for moving quickly to bring the spectrum to market. So these efforts, I think, will be all the more important as we try to meet the new normal of these new usage patterns, and we also continue to try to facilitate the widespread rollout of 5G. So, Joanne, hopefully that's a little bit of a preview, and I'm looking forward to the discussion as well.
Thank you very much, Scott. And, I certainly noted in the first days of the pandemic, you had your number there, 24% increase in voice calls. And I know it was kind of strange the first days of the pandemic that I was trying to make phone call on my mobile, which I use as my main phone, and it wasn't going through. And I think carriers had a lot of rearrangements of trunks for voice that they needed to do at that time. So more capacity for voice. So that goes to your point. Our last but not least speaker is Tom Straub of the Satellite Industry Association, and he will no doubt convince us that satellite is there for 5G. So Tom, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm delighted to be with you again this year. Every year, SIA puts together a State of the Satellite Industry report measuring the growth in the industry, and we knew that there were going to be a lot of questions about the impact of COVID, so we actually added a section to that covering the 4 different segments of the industry that we monitor, and they're satellite manufacturing, satellite services, the launch industry, and ground equipment. And I'm going to run through the impact on each of those segments, but before addressing those, I thought I'd make a few overall comments. First is that the space industry generally was deemed essential by government, which was important to be able to maintain operations. It's easy to forget that when the early days of this, in the early days of the pandemic, it wasn't clear who was going to be able to continue to access their workplaces, manufacturing facilities. And so our member companies had to go through the process of putting in place socially distancing requirements, working with their distribution networks and supply chain to minimize the impact on their operations, which fortunately they were able to do fairly quickly. The major impact really has been on the different customer segments, and I'll cover that in more detail when I talk about the satellite services segment of the industry. But I think it's important to highlight that the unique satellite capabilities have contributed to the pandemic management. In the area of communications, the ubiquitous coverage and constant connectivity that is provided by satellites were very important in being able to address many of the different issues that's related to the pandemic. And then, of course, the Earth observation allowed us to gather and analyze data remotely, which is something that as people had travel restrictions, they were only able to access information via their satellite connections. Let me turn to the satellite manufacturing segment of the industry. Initially, there were some slowdowns due to social distancing and cleaning requirements. Some of the manufacturers addressed that by adding additional shifts to compensate. But fortunately, there were just a modest impact on the schedules of our manufacturers. In addition, prime contractors and other government organizations accelerated the supply chain payment to some of the members of the supply chain in order to make sure that they had continue to have access to the equipment that they needed. Turning now to the satellite services component of the industry, though, which is, as I mentioned before, had much more of an impact based on the customer segments. As you can well imagine, those companies that provide broadband services saw an increase in the demand on their networks, both in terms of the demand by existing customers, but also saw a significant increase in the number of new customers as people began to work from home and continue to access schools from their home. The areas that were negatively affected, though, well imagine, the energy industry had a very significant impact early on in the industry, and that's a big customer of the satellite industry. But also in terms of the maritime and aviation industry, you can well imagine that with the shutdown in cruise lines and the reduction in air travel, because those are two of the faster growing segments of the industry, they had negative impact. And then one of the other areas early on was the broadcast industry, as there was a cancellation of sporting events and other large events which use the satellite industry to distribute content. So they were initially impacted. The remote sensing industry saw an increase in demand for pandemic-related imagery and analysis of satellite data. So it really has been somewhat of a mixed bag in terms of the impact on the satellite industry, the pandemic on the satellite industry. The satellite industry is unique in that it requires launch to be able to put its assets into place. And so fortunately, for the most part, there's not been a significant impact. Providers were able to continue to launch missions. The biggest impact were those that involved international travel early on. Fortunately, there's not been a significant impact because there's an additional step that we have to go through in order to be able to meet the timelines and put in place the assets in order to meet the requirements of our FCC licenses. So fortunately, there has not been a significant impact on the launch segment of the industry. And then the fourth segment of the industry that we measure is the ground equipment segment, which actually by revenue is the largest segment of the industry now. The communications equipment sales were impacted initially, as you can imagine, as airlines are going through the transition from terrestrial-based systems to higher speed satellite systems. There was an impact on the installation of antennas for those systems. There was also an impact on the installers who were impacted initially by the increased demand for consumer services. And then the largest segment of the ground equipment sector is navigation. And far and away, the largest component of that is integrated chipsets. And so that was negatively impacted as the sales of smartphones dropped off as retail establishments were shut down through the second quarter. It continued to be down. I believe it was about 20%. So those are the four segments of the industry that and the different impact that COVID had on them. But before wrapping up, I'd just like to note some of the contributions that the industry has made. Our member companies who provide direct-to-consumer services, broadband services, signed the FCC's Keep America Connected pledge and continue to work with their customer base in order to minimize disruptions as people have had an impact on their ability to be able to access service. The launch and manufacturing sectors shifted to being able to provide ventilators and PPE equipment. We're very proud of their contribution to the response of the industry. And then I mentioned the collection of data that from the pandemic impact, because there are examples of collection data from China as an example, what we'd not otherwise have been able to access. So the communications companies set up Wi-Fi hotspots. They provided service to quarantine soldiers as they were brought back and had to quarantine. We provided service in remote villages in Alaska in order to be able to provide telehealth services. And then we don't think about some of the maritime, the impact on the maritime industry, where the sailors were not necessarily able to get off of their ships, and we were able to continue to provide service for them so that they could stay in touch with their loved ones. So very, very pleased with the contributions of the satellite industry. And Joanne, thank you. I look forward to our discussion.
Joanne, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. So thank you, Tom. And that's quite a good roundup of all the actions taken by the satellite industry. So I know that now we have a panel discussion. We can open that, which is open for questions for the audience. But first, I'd like to provide the results of a poll. As we were talking and presenting, there was a poll for the audience. The question was, what has the COVID-19 crisis highlighted the greatest need for? And I'm not quite sure actually how many answers in total we got, but I can give you the relative results. So the answers suggested were machine-type communications, and 3% of respondents put that as an answer. Low latency was 5%. Network resilience, I think, is the big winner at 43%. So I think that from the participants in this conference this morning, that's definitely the key takeaway from the COVID-19 crisis. Network coverage is 25%, broadband speed at 15%, and broadband capacity at 10%. So I don't know if any of you care to comment on the question of network resilience versus coverage and speed, and what actions were taken on this part. And I believe I'm just going to add there were about 140 votes in total, so not bad. Raise your hand. I think Miguel, maybe you raise your hand, or please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And these three main winners in the pool, we can see that that they are related to these strategic actions that we saw on my presentation, that all the governments and all the carriers were more concerned about. The resilience of the network was something that every people in this world was worried about, that what is going to happen with me if I need to work from home and the network is not enough for that. So that was one of the main concerns, and that I believe that all those concerns are translated to all of them. And I believe that there are not too, I don't know how many Latin American participants are there, because this network coverage is one of the main concerns for the Latin American countries, because there are many rural areas where this digital divide gap has been so I believe that could increase the percentage of the network coverage in the pool. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Tom?
Yeah, I think that this shows that all of the telecommunications providers played an important role in this and continue to play an important role. A satellite industry, of course, provides services in remote areas that can only be accessed by satellites, certainly economically. And so I think that the capabilities of the satellite industry have been very important. But I'll definitely give a shout out to Scott and the wireless providers. I had questions about my ability to operate from home because I wasn't sure whether the network would be able to provide the services that they have. And I think that all of the points in which people voted have been important, but I think each of the industries has had a significant role in enabling people to be able to remain connected, even though more needs to be done, obviously. And so the satellite industry continues to launch new capacity. I mean, the LEO systems that are being launched will be able to provide even lower latency services and expanded coverage and expanded capacity. So I think each of us has a role that we have been playing and will continue to play.
And Joanne, I would agree with what Tom and Miguel said as well too. Network resiliency, coverage, speed; these are the things we were all looking at and tracking in the days and weeks after the pandemic. And I think it's not surprising that voice traffic went up on mobile services. 80% of voice connections in the U.S. were mobile anyway, right before the pandemic. But all of a sudden, every interaction or every conversation that I normally had during the week happened on this device, right? And I mean, every interaction with every member of my team, with our members, all happened over this device. And part of what tried to walk through was a really remarkable strength of networks here in the U.S. After that pandemic. Even with those rises, as you saw, that network performance was remarkably strong and even increased in the weeks afterward. And as I tried to lay out, I think that's as a result of work that was done before the pandemic, having the right regulatory framework, having the right investment. But I think it does underscore the importance of continuing to work on having the right spectrum policies in place. So it's been really impressive watching the FCC not only make spectrum available through the STAs, but also to keep those critical mid-band proceedings on track so that we make sure that we have the resources we need, to meet this new normal.
Matthew, anything you want to add on that subject? Were you concerned about network resiliency in the U.S. In the first days of the pandemic, or?
I think that the categories that did well in the poll were certainly all things that we were concerned about and monitoring closely. And I think that, in the first few days of the pandemic, when you see such enormous shifts in terms of usage patterns, you do hold your breath a bit to see what's going to happen. And I certainly share Scott's views in terms of how well the networks performed. And I think that has a lot to do with the policies that we had in place before the pandemic started. I think that has a lot to do with the proactive efforts that wireless carriers made in the first days of the pandemic. I think that has something to do with the additional spectrum the FCC provided. So I certainly think that in the first few days, the FCC and industry were monitoring things very closely and seeing how things were going to go. But thankfully, as Scott summarized, things have gone well.
All right. Just I want to ask then more specifically, thinking post-pandemic, because we are going to get out of this, right? We all agree, hopefully.
Hopefully.
So, and I had in some of my questions that, I know that the FCC has done a terrific job of awarding all this gigahertz of spectrum and millimeter wave, and carriers like Verizon boast speeds, more than 500 megabit per second where millimeter wave has been deployed. I mean, it's extraordinary for mobile. But on the other hand, as we know, because of COVID, many of our downtown areas and office towers are empty, venues are empty. So, and now there's been a big push for the mid-band, the CBRS, the C-band, and then the extra 100 megahertz that was the FCC will vote on this month. So do you see that maybe the millimeter wave deployment will be a little bit on the back burner over the next year or so, or next couple of years, and that all this COVID-19 and capacity in rural areas and in suburban areas will really put the focus on mid-band? Is that a logical conclusion, or does it have an impact really on carrier deployment plans, if I may ask?
Sure. So just speaking from an FCC perspective in terms of auctions, so the auction schedule, has not changed, and there was always the plan of, once we finished the millimeter wave spectrum auctions, which we did, that the spectrum work was then shifting to the mid-band spectrum. So we had the CBRS auction, as you talked about, this summer. It was only delayed by a month because of the pandemic, and I salute our staff for being able to conduct the auction largely remotely, which was quite an accomplishment. Our work on the C-band spectrum has borne fruit, and we are on track to hold that auction December 8th. That's 200 megahertz of mid-band spectrum. Looking at 2021, the schedule is to have, by the end of 2021, the 3.45 gigahertz band auction, which is 100 megahertz from 3.45 to 3.55, and to hold the auction for the remaining 2.5 gigahertz spectrum that would remain unassigned after the tribal priority window. So I think that even before the pandemic hit, we had a very aggressive mid-band spectrum schedule for 2020 and 2021. We're looking at 4 auctions of mid-band spectrum. And I do think that COVID-19 emphasizes the importance of those auctions, as Scott has indicated, but those auctions, I think, would have happened with or without COVID.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with a lot of what Matthew just said. Chairman Pai talked about the importance of having all 3 types of spectrum: high, mid, and low band spectrum, and them each being important. You look at the 3 auctions that the FCC held for high band spectrum, and they raised roughly $10 billion. Just doing a quick look back this last week, I saw AT&T launching in the, I believe it was the 37 gigahertz band in Milwaukee. Verizon launching its new 5G home fixed wireless access in the 28 and 39 gigahertz bands. I know T-Mobile has also been deploying its millimeter wave spectrum. So I think we'll continue to see deployments there. But as Matthew said, there's a real recognition of the importance of mid-band spectrum, of the need for mid-band spectrum. So I think that's why everyone is so excited and focused on the C-band auction in December, and the FCC has worked very hard resolving issues this summer to keep that auction on schedule. That's I think going to be a centerpiece of 5G networks here, and it's directly responsive to the kinds of things that we saw over the last several months: the need for capacity, the need for coverage. Hearing Chairman Pai talk about the lower 3 gigahertz band and that 3.45 to 3.55 band also is tremendously important. That's a band that's been embraced around the globe for 5G. So those are really, really important efforts. As Matthew said, I think those are we've been working on those efforts, but it's important that we keep up the effort there.
Thank you for that answer. We're beginning to have some questions from the audience, but before we move on to that, since you mentioned the 3.45 to 3.55, and which is spectrum currently used by the Defense Department, I wanted to ask you if you have any comments about the plan of the Pentagon to plan for a national 5G network and in some of the same spectrum, according to the Wall Street Journal anyway, last Friday, and maybe they were a little bit mistaken, I'm not sure, but the Pentagon is planning to have its own network where they would lease spectrum back to the carriers and to others. Are we talking about the same 100 megahertz, or maybe the Pentagon is looking at other frequencies in that band, maybe lower than 3.45? Any comments on that, or Scott or Matthew, whichever?
Scott, you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Sure. You can hear the Bergman dogs reacting to the proposal in the background. I wish I could blame it on Ginger, but no, I think at least one FCC commissioner said last week the RFI is puzzling, and I think that's probably the best reaction that I've heard so far. But our success and the reason that we were able to respond so well in the COVID pandemic is because of the focus on competition and promoting investment. And so, I think that's why you've seen policymakers on both sides of the aisle express concern about potentially having nationalized 5G networks, mandated wholesale networks. I think one of the things that I'm encouraged about is seeing the FCC's continued focus on the 3.45 bands and bringing that spectrum to auction. So that really is a key priority for us as we look ahead.
Thank you.
So on my end, I'm not going to directly respond to that article because I honestly don't know to what extent it's accurate. Yeah. But I will make two general observations that I think are relevant. The first is that at the FCC oversight hearing in the House Commerce Committee last month, all the commissioners were asked whether they opposed a national 5G network. And all of the commissioners said that they opposed a nationalized 5G network. So I think that's one observation. The second observation is that with respect to the 3.45 to 3.55 gigahertz band, we have issued an NPRM to propose to add a non-federal allocation to that band. And the FCC's plan is to go forth and reallocate that spectrum and auction it by the end of 2021. So those are just two observations I would offer.
All right, thank you. We have a question from the floor for you, Matthew, if I can read it, from Noor Wahida of Akubakar U Mobile. She question is you mentioned STAs. Were these free? Were there any compensation associated, and how long do you grant the STAs for? So what's the duration?
Sure. So we did not charge for the temporary use of the spectrum under STAs. In terms of the length of time, so many of the STAs are still in effect. And what we're taking is a really practical approach to this. And I think that one point I would make is that a general point I would make during a pandemic and a crisis is that you do need to take a practical approach to things. And so what we've been looking at is there still the need for the STA given the particular circumstances? Do you still have the shift usage patterns. And to the extent that those still exist, we've been very willing to extend the STAs because we don't want to pull the rug out from under providers and have consumer experience materially worsen. So the short answer is it's a case-by-case determination whether to extend, and many of them are still in effect.
So basically what you're saying is, I know initially they were for 60 days. The STAs, many of them were 60 days. So
many of them were, yeah.
Assignment of 600 megahertz spectrum from Dish that's unused to another, it's still in effect now, basically.
The Dish STA in terms of T-Mobile and 600 is still in effect, yes, and okay. many of them are because in most areas of our country we still do have social distancing. Mm-hmm. In many areas of our country, we still have the virtual learning instead of in-person learning, although we're starting to have some shift back to in-person mm-hmm. learning. So yeah, the need for them has continued in many cases.
Okay, all right. If I may ask, we have a few minutes left. So if I may ask a question of Miguel, you had in your presentation, you talked about that you were worried about keeping connectivity to some of the strategic points. Could you expand on that, what you saw as those areas or those locations that actually needed to maintain connectivity in the early days of the pandemic, and what was done for that?
Yes, of course, I will do it gladly. One thing that we saw is that there were many facilities that were that there were not health centers. For example, there were stadiums that become health centers because the capacity of the hospitals were were rebased. So the carriers work in public partnerships with the government, and they allow to bring connectivity. We saw that some carriers use these small trucks to provide connectivity to those kind of spaces. And we know that a carrier use a boat on the ocean to make a hospital. So we know that those kind of examples were took during the pandemic.
All right. We do have another question from the floor, and so thank you, Miguel. And the question is, I guess, addressed to the FCC again from Veena Rawat of GSMA. Veena is wondering, what is the best estimate of the FCC to have any spectrum available in the US for 5G below 3450 while sharing with the government use? So I guess a subject we touched briefly upon a minute ago. Would you care to answer the question posed in that way?
Sure. So in terms of below 3450, I certainly think there's the potential there for additional commercial use. But I will say that our focus right now and the focus of the federal government agencies is on getting this 3450 to 3550 spectrum sharing done and brought to market. And that has taken an enormous amount of work. And in particular, I do want to pay tribute to the leadership of the White House on that issue and to all the work that's been done by the Defense Department, NTIA, et cetera. So I certainly think that there's promise to get below 3450, but for the next months, our focus really needs to be on making 3450 to 3550 a reality, getting the spectrum sharing procedures in place and bringing it to market through an auction. So I would say 3450 to 3550 now, then we can turn our attention lower.
Okay, well said. Yes, please go ahead.
I would just say, and would second what Matthew said about the importance of focusing on that top 100 megahertz and getting that spectrum to auction quickly. We do also believe that there continue to be opportunities below 3450 as well too. And if you look internationally, you see a significant focus on spectrum all the way down to 3.3 gigahertz. Mm-hmm. I saw a summary recently that showed that 70% of operators worldwide were using spectrum in that 3.4 to 3.3 to 3.4 range for their 5G network. So we certainly hope that there will be opportunities to come back and explore that spectrum as well too.
Thank you. Okay, that's very good. We just have like 1 minute left, so maybe if we can have some concluding comments from each panelist. Then maybe Tom, you want to go first on that?
Sure. I think that the pandemic has shown that there's a need for a variety of services. The demand on networks can change very quickly. And so just within the satellite industry, we saw some of the fastest growth previously in the mobility segment of the industry. That has dropped off considerably, but a significant increase in demand for broadband services. And we need to be able to anticipate that. So in terms of spectrum policy, I think we need to continue to identify the role of different industries and the need for spectrum for them to continue to grow. Thank you.
You're welcome. Miguel, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I believe that also that the pandemic shows us that we need to be prepared. We cannot expect this kind of crisis, but we can expect that we will change the routine, the way that we work, the way that we study. So we need to be prepared for that and to adapt to that. And thank you for the invitation. And thank you to all the panelists.
Scott?
Well, thanks, Joanne. I think I'd just reiterate that the reason that we saw such strong wireless performance here in the US is because of the pro-investment policies that we have in place and because wireless providers have built out their networks. And again, that really reinforces the importance of making sure that we make progress on our key mid-band proceedings and get that spectrum out into use as quickly as we can.
Well, Matthew, as the regulator, you have the last word.
I would echo what my fellow panelists said. I think the pandemic shows the critical importance of wireless broadband networks, and that the pandemic shows the critical importance of making sure we have strong wireless broadband networks through forward-looking policies to make more spectrum available to the marketplace and to ease burdens on the physical deployment of wireless infrastructure. So I think the pandemic reinforces the need to pursue the kind of policies that we had in place before the pandemic started.
All right. Okay, well, I think I'll echo that. I think, if anything, I think, obviously we are here because of those networks, or partially because of those networks, Wi-Fi, fixed, LTE, 5G, satellites. So hopefully next year we won't have to rely on those networks, but who knows? And I think our carriers have done a great job, and regulators during this time have done certainly a great job of keeping all of us connected. And I think that bodes well for 5G. It just says it's really important to keep plugging at it and have no delays, if I may say. So I think that concludes this session. I think Dan may come back up and tell us what's next.
I am indeed. So first of all, importantly, I wanted to start by saying thank you to Joanne and to all of our panelists, and of course to Chairman Pai for his presentation earlier as well. So thank you guys. I think that was a really interesting session, really interesting panel, and a great way to kick things off. Obviously, with where we are at the moment, the whole COVID situation is something that's at the forefront of everyone's mind, and looking at how different industry players and policymakers have reacted, I think is an excellent way to kick off the discussions and today. So thank you all so much, and a really interesting panel. So thank you. So as Joanne says, that is the end of the first session. I think I wanted to mention to all of you out there who've been posting questions. So I know we did have a few questions in. I saw a few questions came in quite late then. I think we didn't have time to reach them. So please do make sure, if you're posting questions, then please do make sure you're posting them early in the session, and we can then make sure those are passed to the audience. So apologies to those of you who did post the questions towards the end and weren't able to get to, but if you can, make sure you're posting them in good time during the sessions, and we'll make sure that all of those are then passed over to the moderators. So next up, we have a short session that we are calling Make Your Introductions. So the idea for this session is to give you all a bit more information about the platform that we're using for for this event, and more specifically some of the different interactive areas. So you can find out more about how you can use those and how you can interact and get involved both in the discussions and also in the networking part of the platforms. So to kick things off, we are just going to show a very short video, which will demonstrate some of the quick features and some of the areas on the platform. And then following that, I'm going to come back up and we're going to have a very short short speed networking session where you'll all have the opportunity to use some of these areas. But to start things off, I would like to play a short video. So hello everybody, and on behalf of all of us at Forum Europe and Forum Global, a very warm welcome to the Global Spectrum Series 2020. Now, all of the events this year are of course going to be taking place in a slightly different format to normal. They're all going to be taking place virtually and online. So because of that, we've just put together this very short video to show you a little bit more about the platform we're going to be using for the event, and hopefully to enable you to make the most of your time with us during the conference. So you can see on the screen here the first page that you'll find when you first enter the platform. This is the reception area. Think of it as the main landing page for the event. You can find general information about the conference, all the logos of our sponsors and partners, and crucially the schedule for each day of the conference and the sessions that will be taking place. Now, down the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the main menu, which directs you to different areas for the conference itself. So you have, first of all, the stages area. So you can see all the stages, all of the sessions, the plenary discussions, the panel debates. They will all be taking place in the stages area. So you can use that area to navigate through to the different sessions that will be taking place. The next area down is the Have Your Say area and the more interactive area of the platform. So you can see here there's some public meeting rooms which you're able to use. And you will also find that during the conference, we're going to have a number of sessions where you will have the opportunity to bring your audio and your video feed live, the Have Your Say sessions there. So you can do that by clicking on the button in the top corner and then accepting all the settings. And as you can see, I've been brought live onto the session, and we have the chance to be part of the debate in that way. Now, one of the ways that this platform may differ from some of the other platforms that you've used for online events is some of the interactive areas that we do have available. And the first ones of those that I wanted to show you is the networking area. So as you can see, you can navigate to that using the third icon down on the left-hand menu. Go into there, you click on the ready button. That will then automatically link you with another person who is also using the site. You can see I've been linked with my colleague James here. You can then have a brief conversation, and as I've just done there, click the connect button to share contact details and virtually exchange business cards. Now, there's also actually a second way that you can also network with people on the platform, and this one's a bit more targeted. So you can use the menu bar on the right-hand side to view the list of attendees, to view everybody who is participating at the event. You can then scroll through the people who are actually on the platform, find maybe a contact that you want to connect with by clicking on them, as I'm going to do very shortly now. You can then send them messages, send one-to-one messages, and actually click on the link there to set up a one-to-one video area. By doing that, you see, I then would just click on the menu to bring my audio and video feed live, and I am then able to connect with my colleague Lula and have a one-to-one private video chat with her. So moving back now to the left-hand menu, and the final area I wanted to show you is the exhibition area. So here you can find the information on all our different exhibitors, and you can find videos, presentations, different demonstrations they're giving. Click on the individual stand and you can see all of the information for that exhibitor by accessing that area there. So please don't forget to do that and check that area out at some point during the event. Finally, I just wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about a couple more of the interactive areas. So during all of the sessions, you will find on the right-hand side, both the chat area is available for general comments, for questions for the speakers, so please do post those in there. And we will also be running polls, which you can access using the tab on the right-hand side there, and you can vote on the different polls that are up there, which will then be brought into the discussion by the moderators during the event. So that's just about it. Thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions at all during your time with us, then please do not hesitate to contact any one of my colleagues using the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. And we really look forward to the event, and thank you again for joining us. So I hope that was useful. It's actually quite a strange feeling introducing a video that was actually with myself in. So, but I hope that was useful anyway to go through the platform and just to kind of give you a brief overview of some of the different areas that are available. Now, as you'd have hopefully learned from that, one of the key features that we have on the platform is the networking side of things. So we now have around about 40 minutes or so before the start of the next session. But for the next 15 minutes, what we wanted to do was to run a short speed networking session. So as you'd have seen on the platform, there are two ways that you can connect and have one-to-one video chats with other people who are on the platform, either using the networking icon down the left-hand side, or by having a look at the list of participants and targeting people specifically and opening up a one-to-one meeting room in that way. So what I'd like to invite you all to do now is to use one of those two methods. Either go to the networking area of the platform, use that on the left-hand menu, or maybe try and connect with somebody that you don't know before. You can connect with them using the list of participants on the right-hand side. So in one of those two ways, please do have a go, try out the networking, try and make some new connections using the platform. As I said, that's going to be live for the next 15 minutes or so. And we then have a short break following that before we're back here on the main stage at 11:30 local Washington time. For our next session, for session 2, which is going to be looking at the evolving shape of the US wireless landscape. So please make sure that you are back here in about 40 minutes or so for that. But in the meantime, have a look at the platform, explore the platform, use those two networking areas. Hopefully you can either reconnect with some old contacts or even make some new contacts. And as I said, we'll be back here in around about 40 minutes or so for the next session. So yeah, enjoy the networking, and we'll see you back here very shortly. Thank you.